Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Montreal chapter of the CSCA and to our public lecture on gender dysphoria towards a biological understanding of gender and gender dysphoria, and our speaker, Tony Jelsma. I'm your host. I'm Joseph Vibihal. I'm a professor in the School of Computer Science at McGill University, and I'm also the Montreal chapter lead of the CSCA. So part of the introductions is I would like to introduce to you the Canadian Science and Christian Affiliation. So this group, so there's a few ways that you can sort of interact with it. You can interact with it from a distance by watching our YouTube videos, Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. You can sign up for our events email where you'll be notified of events. There is no solicitation that happens through this. It's just to be notified of the events that will happen in the Montreal area or in any area that you want to be notified about, because you can select other areas besides Montreal. This is the website, the csca.ca website, and you can interact with this organization even closer by going to the blog, which is a curated blog, or you can become a member, and you get access to this peer-reviewed journal that comes up. And the CSCA is a fellowship of scientists and those interested in science who want to understand how science should best interact with the life-given Christian tradition. I like to think of the CSCA as kind of two branches. One branch is scientists who are of faith, who want to explore with science in a safe environment questions that we all sort of struggle with. So whether we hold to 7 days or 14 billion years, it's a safe environment to have these kinds of conversations. And besides it being an organization of scientists, it's also an organization of just anyone who finds both science and faith a very important thing to sort of merge and understand. So I welcome anybody who wants to talk about this more with me later. All right, so the next thing I would like to do is introduce our speaker. Now, Tony is a professor of biology in Dordt University, Sioux Center, Iowa. Tony was born in Burlington, Ontario, so he is a Canadian, hurrah. He received his Bachelor of Science and PhD from McMaster University in biochemistry and molecular biology. He did postdoctoral research in England, which was cancer research, and Montreal's General Hospital Research Institute with nerve regeneration. He then found his calling in teaching at Christian institutions, first at Crandall University in Moncton, New Brunswick, and has been teaching at Dordt University in Iowa since 2000. Courses he teaches at Dordt include anatomy, physiology, genetics, and developmental biology. He is an elder in his Presbyterian church and still finds time to play hockey, and we won't talk about his choice teams. So I think I'll just let this switch over to Tony. Welcome, Tony. We're very happy to have you here.
Well, thanks for that introduction. I do remember the Stanley Cup parade when Montreal won the Cup last, which was 92, 93 or something like that. And that's more than I can say for my Maple Leafs because it was a whole lot longer there. So, but thanks for the opportunity to talk about this field, which is really difficult, complicated. some of you may know I gave a presentation this summer at the ASA annual meeting. And then Jim Peterson said, well, we want to have a theme issue on this topic. And would you be interested in being a guest editor for it? So I said, yeah, sure, that's fine. And oh, by the way, you need to write a 5,000-word essay, which is a call for papers by the end of October. So I did a big gulp and I said, okay. Unfortunately, 5,000 words turned out to be 10,000 words because this field is so huge and rapidly expanding. And hopefully I can give you some sense of that. We don't have answers, and that's one of the big themes I want to bring out. There are many different situations, and generalizing is really dangerous. So what I'm going to do to outline, I'll go through some definitions because it's important to know what words mean. We'll talk about development and what do we know about sex and gender development, and then we'll talk about transitioning from one sex to the other, and I warn you there's going to be some fairly gory details in that, but I feel it's important to bring them out. And then there's some questions about recent increases in the number of cases of gender dysphoria, and what do we do about that. And then I'll talk about 3 different Christian approaches that have been used to address this question. And again, take-home message is there is much that we don't understand, and we can't generalize. As I say, if you've met one trans person, you've met one trans person. So we have to be really careful about that, and I see that in the literature often, all too often, this generalization. So definitions: sex and gender. So sex is our biological sex. Gender is our internal sense of whether we are male or female, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Gender incongruence simply means that your sex and your gender are not the same. Gender dysphoria means you have a dysphoria or a sense of distress about that incongruence. So it used to be called just gender dysphoria, and people generally still do that, but technically speaking, the two are distinct. Binary versus non-binary. So if we're talking about binary, you're either male or female. You could be cis or trans, but you're still binary. But there's also non-binary, where they don't identify as either male or female. And that may be a different situation. And I really don't know what to say about that. In the end, we've got some acronyms. This is when you transition. So male to female or female to male. And to note, so if someone transitions from male to female, then they are a trans woman. And if they transition from female to male, then they are a trans man. So you identify them by what they have transitioned to. Okay, so sex versus gender. So biological sex, this is a genetically determined program. So this is a developmental program. And as I mentioned before, gender is our internal sense of whether we're being male or female. So is there a relationship between the two? And I think for most of us, we don't even think about our gender. So we look down in the shower and we know what our sex is, and then that is our gender as well. But gender dysphoria or gender incongruence is a different thing. So let's go through a little bit of developmental biology. At 6 weeks after fertilization, the human embryo is what we call bipotential. And that means they could be either male or female. And if you look at the figure, we have the sets of plumbing for both male and female. And if you go male, then one set develops and the other one regresses, and vice versa. So if you are genetically male, you have a Y chromosome, and there's an SRY gene on that chromosome. And when that SRY gene gets turned on around this time, 6 weeks, that stimulates what is the gonad, a primordial gonad, to develop into testes. And then as they form testes, they will produce testosterone. And then the testes, they will stimulate the further development of the male reproductive system. And then the female parts will regress. And of course, if you don't have that, likewise, the genitals will develop in the male pattern as well. So the external genitalia, a lot of them are also bipotential. You can get a penis or a clitoris and things like that. But then if you have testosterone, then the genitals will develop in the male pattern. And if you don't have an SRY gene, then you get female development. So female development is the default pattern. So here I'm talking about the reproductive organs, but the brain is also sexualized, if that's the right word to use. And the general way of thinking about this is that there are two stages of brain sex development: organization and activation. So we'll talk about the organization stage, which happens just before birth. I may need to qualify some of this, but in general, we have male fetuses. They have testes, they produce testosterone, and females don't. The testosterone enters the brain, and that will masculinize the brain. Now, this is an oversimplification because studies in rodents have shown that the testosterone enters the brain and is converted to estrogen, and it's actually estrogen that masculinizes the male brain. Now, if you're studying rodents, we don't know about gender. That's just sexual behavior. We do know that in humans, that enzyme that converts testosterone to estrogen also is found in the human brain, but to what extent it regulates gender, we really don't know. So that's the first stage. The second stage is activation, which occurs at puberty. So when the person enters puberty, if they're male, they start producing higher levels of testosterone, and that will reorganize the brain or organize the brain in a way to produce male sexual behaviors, and females will increase their levels of estrogen and progesterone to induce female sexual behaviors. Note, what I forgot to mention is, even though there's an organization stage before birth, boys generally behave different than girls. Now, I have to be careful how I say that because there's a lot of overlap, and certainly the environment plays a role. But in general, the organizational stage also has behavioral consequences. And just in case I haven't been clear about this, the sexual behaviors that are expressed, those are outward behaviors. And we need to distinguish that from gender identity, which is our internal sense of whether we are male or female. So this is kind of the general pattern. And I guess the question is, how much of this is nature and nurture? And we don't know. That might be difficult. But also the other question is, how could the environment affect development? If there is a environmental component to sex or even gender, how might that occur? So let's look at the brain development. And I teach developmental biology, and one of the concepts I talk about is called Waddington's developmental landscape. So it's a model that's used to explain how you can start from a single cell to many cells of different cell types that are doing different things. So if you can imagine, that ball in the figure is a cell, and it starts rolling down this hill. And as it rolls down the hill, it needs to make a decision which pathway it's going to follow. Now, this simplified diagram only gives a few choices, but it needs to, and so each of those choices would be a different developmental fate. You could say, is it going to be a brain cell, or is it going to be a muscle cell, or something else like that? And the further you go down the pathway, then the more fixed and stable that pattern or that identity becomes. Now, if you look at this pattern, if you roll, let's say, 1,000 balls down that slope, you'll get roughly similar, the same number of proportion of cells in those different pathways each time. So you could say it's kind of genetically programmed because the topology is genetically programmed. But you can also imagine if there's something that's going to perturb the ball a little bit, they may tend to go in one pathway or another differently as well. So usually we think of this model as what happens to a cell and how its cell fate develops. But I'm wondering, could this be a similar thing for brain development? In other words, when the brain is developing, it's developing pathways, it's making new connections, it's strengthening certain pathways, and developing different brain functions based on circuitry. So could a similar sort of thing be happening as well, where in general you have a certain pathway that the different neurons will follow, but it could be altered as well? And I'm just throwing that out there, but I really don't know if that is the case. Okay, so what about gender incongruence or gender dysphoria? And so this would be a conflict between one's sex and one's sensed gender. The frequency of this is really hard to determine because It really depends. I've seen studies that say it's less than 1%. I've seen studies that say 3%. I think last week I saw a report of a study where they asked high school students, do you identify as cisgender or something else? And 10% of them said something else. So it's really hard to know that, but it's a pretty low percentage. And usually people say about 1%. When it comes to this gender incongruence, there are two types: early onset and late onset. And so I'll talk about the first one first. So the early onset. So these are children, and as they're growing up, they always insist that they are the opposite sex. And so if they can verbalize that, they've said, I've always felt that I'm the wrong gender relative to my sex. Now, the intensity of that incongruence or dysphoria, that can vary. Maybe over time that can vary, or even from person to person it can vary. It really depends. And what was surprising to me when I first found this out is, in most cases, this goes away upon puberty. It seems that the increase in hormone levels that occurs at puberty resolves most of the cases. Now, you notice I say 60 to 90%. Again, that's really hard to tell, and it depends on the study. But the take-home message for that is a lot of cases do desist upon puberty, and it's really hard to know why. And then if we did know why, that would help a lot, as I'll talk about later. And what about non-binary people? Again, I really don't know, but this kind of stable situation where you're either male or female may not happen in the case of these people. So if we have this incongruence or dysphoria, is there a biological basis? And I've looked long and hard for different possible biological explanations, and I'll go through a couple of the main ones. First one, you may have seen some studies that talk about sexually dimorphic regions of the brain. And what this means is that if you compare males and females, there are some structures in the brain that are of different sizes, some bigger in men and some bigger in women. And so then the question would be, well, what about a trans person? Would their brain be more like the gender they identify with rather than their birth sex, their birth gender? And as may not be surprising, the results are not clear. There are multiple reasons for this. First of all, it's not a black and white distinction. Like the sizes of these structures, there's overlap between men and women, and they vary as well. So it's really hard to look at one person's brain and say, I know for sure this person is male or not. That's one reason. The other thing is there aren't many studies that have looked at this. You need a postmortem brain sample to look at that. The other thing is, have those people undergone hormone treatments, which might affect the structures of the brain? And then also, if they've been acting according to their perceived gender, does that change the structure? So we need to distinguish cause from effect as well. And then lastly, we really don't know what those structures do. We kind of associate them with sexual behavior or maybe even gender because they're different between male and female, but we really don't know what they do. So you'll see papers about it, but I don't find this to be that helpful in understanding the biological basis. What I do find more promising is the role of hormones in gender. And what I'm going to talk about is several different conditions where we have hormonal imbalances or hormonal effects, and these correlate with gender dysphoria. So androgen insensitivity syndrome. So people with this condition are genetically male, they have testes, they make testosterone, but their body's receptor for testosterone is either completely non-functional or only minimally functional. So we have a distinction between partial AIS or complete AIS. And so I saw a recent study where they looked at a number of people with AIS, and one of the questions they asked them is, what gender do they identify as? So remember, female is the default pathway. So all these people, they developed as females, physically females. And what they found was people who had complete androgen insensitivity, they identified as female. However, out of 14 people who had partial androgen insensitivity, 11 of them identified as male, even though their bodies were female. So this suggests to me that even a small amount of the effect of testosterone can play a role in gender determination. So that's males with androgen insensitivity. The opposite is congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which I'll call CAS because it's too big to pronounce. What happens in this case is the adrenal gland, which produces a hormone which acts like testosterone. We call them androgens. And so the adrenal gland produces them. And in this condition, the adrenal gland is overproducing them, mainly because the adrenal gland itself grows too big. So these act like male hormones. So in general males, they produce testosterone, so the effect of that is minimal. But in females, those androgens are important for things like aggression and maybe sex drive and things like that. So what they have found that girls who have CAS, there's a higher proportion of gender dysphoria in those cases. It's not a complete thing, but there's a higher proportion. And again, it leads to the question of, well, does testosterone to a certain extent or some other androgen affect gender? And then the last case is diethylstilbestrol. And DES is a synthetic estrogen that used to be taken quite a few years ago to pregnant mothers to prevent miscarriage. And I think we're thinking back in the 50s or so. And what they found is that girls whose mothers had been taking this, they had disorders of sexual development. There were really serious problems with that. But what they've also found are some cases of gender dysphoria that seems to be related to that. So in all three cases, there are some kind of clues that a hormone imbalance can in some cases affect gender. And before I move on to another thing, Greg Eilers is a person I've been in contact with, and he's a retired Lutheran pastor, Missouri Synod, so a very conservative denomination. He had lifelong gender dysphoria, and he was convinced that his mother took DES before he was born. And if you read his book, it's called A Roller Coaster Through a Hurricane. He describes what he went through. And eventually the distress got so bad, he had to retire from the ministry. He tried all kinds of things to no avail, and he transitioned to Gina. So you can see the picture of Greg as Gina at that point. And so for a few years, he was Gina. And as part of this transitioning, so he had surgeries and things like that, he was taking estrogen. And then after a while, he noticed that his dysphoria, or his sense of being woman, that disappeared when he was taking estrogen. So he thought, so I'll just transition back. I'll stop taking the estrogen. And then the dysphoria came right back. So what he's ended up doing is he continues to take estrogen, and but then his dysphoria disappeared. So he's transitioned back to Greg. And he's a fascinating character, and he's been really a help to me as I've been asking lots of questions as well. So again, in Greg's case, it seems like some kind of hormones. Exactly how that works, we don't know, except we do know that estrogen and testosterone, they regulate the expression of a whole bunch of genes, and so they could affect the brain in some way. But we really don't know anything more than that. The last thing I wanted to mention is there is a pretty high proportion of other comorbidities, as they say. A lot of people with gender dysphoria have autism. There's also been, to a lesser degree, higher number of cases of schizophrenia and ADHD. So I'm not sure what's cause and effect. Maybe there's a similar sort of thing going on in the brain that contributes to autism and gender dysphoria. I'm not sure. But a couple of years ago, a paper related to that, Stephen Glisky, he came up with this idea, and he just proposed it he called it the multi-sense theory of gender dysphoria. And what he described was that our sense of gender, it comes from a lot of different systems in the brain that are kind of working together, and that can be modified. So if you have sense of distress, or as you mentioned, signals from social behavioral network, or even disorders of body ownership and perception, maybe a combination of disorders of those three could contribute to your sense of gender and maybe contribute to gender dysphoria. So you see, he put this paper out, and just as a kind of a hypothesis, the paper was not well received. And you can still look at it, but the journal ended up retracting the paper because they didn't like the idea that gender dysphoria is actually a disorder. So Gliski himself was, I guess, not happy about that, but we really don't know what's going on. But this was just one suggestion of a possible cause. Picking up on the body ownership and perception idea, gender dysphoria is often associated with an intense distress at a particular body part that's associated with their sex. So, for example, if you have a female who wants to transition to a male, so a birth female, their breasts might give them distress, and they really want to have it removed. So, and vice versa for the other ones. When I saw that, I was reminded of a condition called foreign limb syndrome, where you have a similar situation. So people would say, for example, the lower leg does not belong to them, and they may go to extreme lengths to have it amputated because it just does not belong to them. No, I'm not trying to say they're the same thing, but then I do wonder if we're dealing with multiple brain systems, could that sort of distress in terms of body parts, could that be a part of it as well? Again, I'm just throwing this out there because I really don't know for sure, but I was just kind of struck by that. So that's the early onset gender dysphoria, and I'll go back more later to talk about transition, but now introduce later onset gender dysphoria. And this appears in adolescence once the child reaches puberty and into adolescence. And so such a person has not previously expressed dysphoria, but it seems to be entering puberty that triggers it. So we think of the organization and activation stage of sexual behavior. This seems to be associated with that. And in this case, it could involve a rapid change in gender identity. So, and I'm suggesting it is somehow associated with the activation stage, but exactly how, I'm not sure. Or is there environmental contribution to it as well? And again, we can't generalize, but I do wonder if there are different categories, and I'll talk about that in a bit. One of the things we need to be careful about is, can we confuse atypical sexual characteristics with gender incongruence? For example, if you have a male who exhibits what other people might think of as female types of behaviors, that's not gender incongruence, and we got to make sure that we don't confuse it. Or a girl who might act more like a tomboy, that's not the same. But as we'll see, that may be part of it. I'm just realizing now that I forgot to mention the desistance that childhood gender dysphoria has. In many cases, maybe even most cases, if the dysphoria desists, these people still are same-sex attracted. So there is something still, but it may be not gender dysphoria, it may be same-sex attraction, and the two could be confused. So this point reminded me of that. So that's late onset gender dysphoria. And what we're finding, and you may have heard yourself, is that there's been a dramatic increase in recent years in the number of cases of gender dysphoria. And if you look at the graph here, the biggest increase is in adolescent females. It's several times larger than adolescent males. And when you see this, you start to wonder what's going on, what might be the causes. So what might be the causes? One possibility is, well, we're getting better at diagnosing gender dysphoria. And that could well be the case, but that doesn't explain why there's more females than males. And the other thing is, to diagnose gender dysphoria is really a self-diagnosis situation, because you can't tell if a person has what their gender is. They have to tell you. That's not to say it's not real, but it's entirely a self-reporting thing. And Yarhouse and Sadusky wrote a book, and in that they describe this kind of a looping effect, where if you don't know what gender dysphoria is, you're not going to diagnose yourself as having it. Now that is becoming more prominent in our culture, in our society, people are going on the web and finding and learning about gender dysphoria. Then they might say, oh, this must be what I have, or it may be what I have. And then slowly or over time, it gets more and more prominent, and more people diagnose themselves as having it. Again, that does not explain why there's more females than males. But as for this idea of the looping effect, there's a recent paper that described this phenomenon, and I'm going to apologize ahead of time for this really busy slide, but I'm quoting some stuff from this. So this is Lisa Littman's paper where she defined rapid onset gender dysphoria. So she said it describes a phenomenon where the development of gender dysphoria is observed to begin suddenly during or after puberty in an adolescent or young adult who would not have met criteria in childhood. So it seems to be an entity that is distinct from the gender dysphoria observed in individuals who were previously described as transgender, like the early onset. What struck her was the worsening of the mental well-being and the parent-child relationships and behaviors that was associated with the gender dysphoria arising. And so she found that quite concerning. And so she wanted to do more research into this. And so she went online, she contacted parents, or she went on a blog that was parents of trans kids, and she was doing some surveys of that. And she continues to write, these parents are reporting that their children are experiencing rapid onset gender dysphoria, first appearing, which is what I mentioned before, and the onsets seem to occur in the context of belonging to a peer group where one, multiple, or even all of the friends have become gender dysphoric and trans-identified during the same time frame. So she used the word social contagion, and that really hit a trigger. But that was kind of what she was wondering about. And then the parents also noticed that there was a dramatic increase in the use of social media before this disclosure, suggesting that maybe this is where the kids got the idea from, or they were encouraged to do so. This is really scary. And so the response to this was not really, it wasn't very well received. But so she did a study to try to document and say what's going on. As I mentioned, this paper was not well received. However, and it was critiqued on methodological grounds, but other countries have found the same thing. In the UK, there's an organization, the Tavistock Clinic, where there was a similar concern with what's going on. I've seen, I think it was a Swedish and a Finnish paper, that the number of cases of adolescent females was much higher than males as well. So it's not a localized North American thing. It seems to be further. Now, again, this seems really strange that you could have something like a social contagion for something as dramatic as a gender dysphoria. And then last week I found this, and again, this is my last really busy slide. I found a couple papers which kind of got me wondering. And just looking at the wording, so what's happened? The first paper describes that there are a lot more people who are in young females who are displaying tic-like behavior, sort of like Tourette's. And they're using the words rapid onset. And this has happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the wording says it's an epidemic diffusion over a relatively short time, and involves or suggests the involvement of suggestibility and behavioral modeling. The second paper also came out this past year, where they studied people who had also these increased numbers of tics. They found out that these people, again, adolescent girls, were watching TikTok videos of people with Tourette's, and they would spend a lot of time watching them, and that seemed to imprint in some way the same sort of tics in their own behavior. Again, this is not the same as gender dysphoria, but I just found it striking that the language is so similar and the idea of suggestibility was there. And now these people, they need counseling to try to minimize the effects of these tics. What that means, I don't know, but it just struck me. And here I have another concern is, in our culture, are there kind of defined gender roles? Boys should act this way and girls should act this way. And if you don't act this way, well, then maybe you are trans. And I think that's a challenge because we shouldn't really be acting that way. We should just let people behave the way they are and not tell them how they should act if they're a boy or a girl. I think it's especially concerning that the church itself in many cases seems to be doing that. I don't know how many of you are aware of Kristen Kobus Dumais' recent book, Jesus and John Wayne, which talks about many examples of the evangelical church. Kind of males need to be strong and tough and brave, and the females need to be much more soft and loving and things like that. And so John Wayne has nothing to do with the church. And so there's a concern in that regard. And all you need to do is read Proverbs 31 about the good wife, and she does not fit that stereotype that the Jesus and John Wayne model seems to be doing. So if you are expected to behave a certain way according to your sex, what if you don't? And then you might be wondering, are you actually the opposite sex? And lastly, I've never been one, but I think being an adolescent girl is much harder than being an adolescent boy. Misogyny is rampant, sexual harassment. There are many other inequalities, and that can make becoming a male much more attractive. So a male to female transition, I think, has greater social consequences than a female to male transition. So again, are there some things that are kind of pushing or possible explanations for some of these increased numbers of adolescent females? Okay, I'll stop here for a minute, because now I'm going to transition, pun not intended, to transitioning. So we can talk about three different levels of transitioning. They're going to be entirely social, or they can be hormonal. So then we start making more permanent changes, and then there can be the surgical transition. Now, it depends on the individual. You don't need to do all of them. Some people do. And even the surgeries, it kind of depends on the person, depends on their financial resources and things like that. But in general, we talk about any of those stages as transitioning. Before any transitioning starts, the individual needs psychotherapy and counseling to assess the situation. Is this person really gender dysphoric? What worries me a little bit is that counseling is prescribed to be gender affirmation counseling. In other words, if the child presents and says they're gender dysphoric, the approach that is required is to affirm them in that. Now, I can see that conversion therapy does not work and it's really cruel and brutal, but I do wonder, to what extent do we have to be careful to say, does this person really have gender dysphoria? And is there not something else that might be the case? And I'll get back to that a little bit. So assuming that the person is genuinely gender dysphoric, then the next stages are what's called social transitioning. And then this is to confirm that the person is ready for further transitioning. And so they will change their hair, depending whether they're going male to female or the other way around. They'll change their clothing. If they're females, they'll have chest binding to flatten their breasts, so that doesn't become as obvious. They'll change their mannerisms to suit better the opposite sex. They can get voice coaching so that their voice sounds more of the opposite sex as well. And so if this goes well and the person's encouraged by that, then the next stage would be hormone treatments. And in order for hormones to be provided, the condition must be persistent. The person must be able to consent. And even though there may be comorbidities, they need to be well controlled. So as you're going to start the transitioning with hormones, we need to make sure that other things aren't going to be a problem. And all during the hormone treatments, the patient needs to be monitored in case there are adverse events as well. And so what happens? So in a female to male transition, then the person would be prescribed testosterone. The person would make their own estrogen, but usually the testosterone would be enough to swamp it out. We think of testosterone as kind of a dominant type of hormone. But it may be necessary to use what's called puberty blockers or gonadotropin-releasing hormone agonists, GnRHA, to suppress the estrogen. What happens then when the hormone treatments begin, there'll be a redistribution of body fat and muscle depending on which direction you're going. The genitals will change. For example, the clitoris will start to enlarge. The testes in males will get smaller. There can be hair changes and voice changes, especially in a female to male transition. The larynx will get bigger and the voice will drop. if you're doing a male to female, then we do need to suppress the testosterone. So they will take estrogen, but they also need to take this GnRHA to suppress testosterone. That drug is actually quite expensive. And so a much cheaper version is called spironolactone, that was used to regulate sodium and potassium levels in the blood, but it also works here. So that may be a possibility as well. And so these people, they'll take estrogen and something to suppress the testosterone, and you get similar sorts of changes, except in the opposite direction. There is a loss of sex drive. Breast growth will develop. Hair will change. So females to males, they'll start to grow a beard and things like that, and the genitals will change as well. I also need to note that there are also psychological effects. I shouldn't make a distinction between psychological and physiological. They're both physiological. However, testosterone does make people feel better. So if you have a female to male who's taking testosterone, it's almost like a high that they get, and they feel great because they're taking it. And, that can be an encouragement for them to continue. So that's hormonal treatments. Now we'll get to surgeries, and here's where I get pretty explicit. My apologies in advance. So I'll describe both things. We have two different types or categories of surgeries. The non-genital surgery could be mastectomy, removing the breasts, and maybe doing some other chest contouring, some surgeries to contour the face so that it's more like a male than a female. And then you also have the genital surgery. And so you need to know that the genital surgery does not produce a normally functioning penis. And so first of all, we need to have a hysterectomy to remove the ovaries, the uterus, and then remove the ovaries as well. And then you construct a penis. Now, there's two ways to do this. Metoidioplasty uses the skin of the labia and the clitoris and to construct a penis. And so the clitoris is enlarged due to hormone treatments, and there's a little ligament that holds it close to the body. That ligament is cut. And then you can use skin that is down there already to construct a penis. The penis is small, but it is sexually responsive, but it's not capable of penetrative intercourse. But it does look like a penis. The alternative is phalloplasty, where they take tissue from elsewhere in the body and they use that to construct a penis. The problem with that is it doesn't have the sexual responsiveness. So it's the size of a regular penis, but it's not sexually responsive. And then you also have scrotum construction. You have prosthetic testes. And so for many people, it's just to have something that is a penis. That is really what they're going for, and they're content with it, even though it doesn't function like a normal penis. Now, if we move to male to female surgeries, again, we have non-genital surgeries, so facial feminization, voice modification. You can do surgery of the larynx to make the voice higher. Again, we can do body contouring and things like that. The genital surgery, like with the female to male, you do not get a normally functioning vagina. First of all, you need to remove all the hair down there because that would really cause a problem. Again, you're removing the gonads, the testes in this case, and you remove the penis, or at least the inside parts of the penis, and you use the skin of what's left to construct a vagina. And you can use part of the glands of the penis to construct the clitoris. So again, you still have sexual sensitivity. However, you don't have a vagina that is really suitable for intercourse, because the skin or the inside of a vagina is very different tissue than the skin that's used to construct it. And I can go into more details, but suffice it to say, intercourse would be painful with them. And also, there are frequently complications, and you need to go back in for secondary procedures as well. But it looks like a vulva. Okay, so that's one thing. So now I'm moving to a different topic, which is some of the controversies over childhood transitioning. And so if someone has the early onset gender dysphoria, when is a good time to do the transition? As I mentioned before, many, if not most of the cases of gender dysphoria, they resolve or desist upon puberty. So should we transition them before puberty? Because then you might have some people transition whose cases actually would resolve over time. So we don't really know which ones persist, and that's the problem. It's not possible right now to predict which ones will persist and which ones will desist. And unfortunately, if it is genuine gender dysphoria, when they reach puberty, the dysphoria intensifies as the sexual development occurs. And that's not surprising, because then you get breast development or other things, body hair, and that's going to cause increased distress. And moreover, if you wait until puberty to transition, well, then you've got these extra secondary sexual characteristics and so the transitioning is a whole lot more complicated than if it were done before puberty. But one of the concerns is, if a child has not yet reached puberty, can they really appreciate the consequences of transitioning? Do they really know what that all entails, the implications of that, loss of fertility and things like that? And so there's a concern about doing it too soon, because it might go away, or they might realize, I just don't want to go through it. So one approach then is watchful waiting. And if you do the watchful waiting, you let the person go into puberty and then see what happens with the resulting consequences. There's another approach called the Dutch protocol, but it's not just Dutch, but it started in the Netherlands. And I mentioned the GnRH which blocks the sex hormones. It's also called a puberty blocker. And so these drugs were developed for children with precocious puberty. So just to wait till they reach the age when puberty normally occurs. And so that's where they're normally used. And so the strategy here is, well, if the child's not old enough to understand the implications of transitioning, then why don't you give them puberty blockers? And so that'll just delay puberty, and it's reversible for a couple of years or so they have a better sense of what's going on. And if that's the case, then you don't have the secondary sex characteristics to worry about, and then transitioning would be a lot easier. However, the puberty blockers, as their name implies, also blocks them from entering puberty. And if it's puberty that actually resolves the gender dysphoria, then the puberty blockers are going to prevent that desistance from occurring. And so you're kind of in a catch-22, because if you give them puberty blockers, you essentially ensure that everyone will stay gender dysphoric and everyone will transition, even though many of them might not have done that. And then there are other things as well. So during the time when children normally reach puberty, they have an increase in bone density. And if you delay that with using these puberty blockers, then their bone density is less. Now, that may not be a huge deal, but in the long run, that could have some consequences as well. And that bone density is not regained when the child goes off puberty blockers. The other thing is, if you have a male to female transitioning, if the child has not reached puberty, the penis has not grown large enough due to puberty, and you won't have enough skin to construct a vagina as well. So that also presents a problem. So despite the concerns that I'm expressing here, this actually is the recommended approach in the UK and the US. I'm not sure about elsewhere, but it is kind of the recommended approach. The child is dysphoric. We have a way to deal with it. And so let's go ahead and do that. What about regret and detransitioning? And I saw a blog on Facebook today where people are saying there's increasing numbers of regret and detransitioning. And it's really hard to know what the actual numbers are, but everything I've read is that the incidence of regret is low, that most people who transition, surgically or otherwise, they are happy with their transition and they don't want to go back. And important factors in that really are support from family and friends, and whether the surgery was reasonably successful. These are not trivial surgeries, and the more successful it was, the more likely they're happy with it and less likely to regret doing it. There's a recent study, again by Lisa Littman, where she surveyed 100 people who detransitioned and asked them why. And you notice the numbers add up to greater than 100%. So people gave multiple answers, but some of the reasons were they're just more comfortable in their natal sex. So they transitioned, but they didn't feel any better that way, so they went back. Or there could be complications, or maybe it wasn't really gender dysphoria. And then about a quarter of the people experienced discrimination for transitioning. And that is a very real problem as well. That doesn't say anything about proportions of people who detransition. I think it's still low. But again, the numbers are really not there yet. Okay, I'm going to switch gears again. I'm just looking at the time. I don't have that much more to go. So how do we as Christians view this whole question? First of all people are created in the image of God and thus require a love and care, regardless of their situation. Secondly, I believe that sex and gender, the binary, is rooted in creation. We can talk about, God created the male and female, but there's more than that as well. If we look through Scripture, and there's a book I was reading, The Theology of the Body, and it describes the whole story of Scripture as being one of complementary relationships. We're starting in Genesis 2, even with a marriage. If you look at the Song of Solomon, the whole book is about sex. Jesus' incarnation was a conception, and we think of the church as being the bride of Christ. And all the way through, idolatry is considered to be adultery. And so it seems like that complementary relationship is a very consistent theme in Scripture. Secondly, even after we die, we retain our identity and our sex. So, for example, on the Mount of Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah were still male, even though they were dead and they were talking with Jesus on the mountain there. And Jesus himself, after he rose from the dead, was still male. So, again, I think our sex and our gender are integrally part of who we are. However, this is a broken world, and things are not as they should be. So then, because this doesn't always happen, and how do we as Christians deal with this situation? So there are different ways to deal with it. So Yarhouse and Tedeschi, in their book, they describe 3 Christian approaches, and which I'll describe next slide. So the integrity approach, and Walt Heyer is one who promotes that. And so this approach says that, yes, a gender sex binary, that's rooted in creation, male and female. Any deviation from that is due to sin, and the only goal of treatment is restoration of the binary of sex and gender being the same. And if not, then it's simply a burden that the person must bear. And in heaven, it'll be resolved. But for the time being, that's just what they need to deal with. Unfortunately, I've seen some videos, including Walt Heyer and Laura Perry is another example. Some people have detransitioned upon either turning to Christ or returning to their faith or their childhood. And so they have, and so then the implication is all you need is Jesus in order to get this restored. And again, we can't extrapolate from a couple people to everyone else. But this is one of those positions. So again, we have to be careful when we see examples not to extrapolate to everyone else. So that's the integrity approach. The next approach, I had mentioned Greg Eilers, the pastor, but this is called the disability approach. And again, as before, the gender sex binary is rooted in creation. However, this is a broken world, and sometimes things aren't as they should be. Transitioning might be necessary for the good of the individual. So if the person is expressing such distress, suicide rates are really high for people with gender dysphoria. It's like 40%. And so if they're experiencing such distress, well, then maybe we need to do something to relieve that distress. We also need to be very careful to destigmatize this gender incongruence. So if there are trans people who are believers and they say, I'm doing this because this is the only way I can function, we certainly need to support them and encourage them and not shun them. And I think the church has not done a very good job of that. And speaking personally, I haven't either. The third approach is the diversity approach, and Austin Hartke is an example of that. And in this position, the gender sex binary is in creation, but it's descriptive, not prescriptive. In other words, something in between or variations from that binary, they are to be celebrated. There's lots of variation in creation, and that sort of variation in humans is also to be celebrated. This position says we should destigmatize gender incongruence. Sure, we should. But it also says we should depathologize gender incongruence. And my only concern about that is if it's not a pathology, what about all the surgeries and the treatments that are needed in order to resolve the incongruence? So that's a question I'm not sure. As I'm reading through Austin Harkey's book, he's comparing trans people to eunuchs in the Bible. So eunuchs were never, they're somewhere in between male and female. And he says, trans people are in a similar sort of situation. And as we know in the Bible, eunuch people or believers who are eunuchs are also welcomed. Philip and the Ethiopian is an example in there. So those are the three different approaches that Christians have taken. And you can decide which one fits you best. Lastly, just a few other questions. I've also read, transition surgeries, they mutilate the body, so therefore we shouldn't be doing anything like that. However, what about piercings, tattoos, and things like that? Are they also mutilating the body? And so can we use that argument? And I don't think that argument holds water. Are there analogous situations where we can do something that is a drastic surgery but yet it is necessary? For example, if we have cancer, we may remove a part of the body which makes the person less healthy, but it keeps them alive. As I mentioned earlier, the phantom limb syndrome, it wasn't phantom limb syndrome, was the other one. But anyway, body integrity identity disorder, where a certain part of your body doesn't feel like it's part of it. I've seen arguments that, maybe we should allow them to amputate that as well, simply because that is a situation that is causing real distress and it could help. And so is transitioning simply making the best of a difficult or bad situation? There is dysphoria. Can we resolve that? So last slide here. So I'm just going to summarize before I open it up to questions. Gender dysphoria is the distress associated with the incongruence between sex and gender. The origin of this is not clear. I'm still looking for some kind of clear biological indication. I think the closest I can come to it is saying hormones seem to be involved in some way for the early onset, maybe for the later onset as well. Again, what's the role of the social contagion in the late onset or in some late onset cases? We don't know. But again, this is something that needs to be worked through. And transitioning can mean a bunch of different things, and not everyone goes through all the different steps. And lastly, Christians have different perspectives on gender. So I will end there and see if anyone has any questions.
So I do have a private question, and Ed raised his hand. So I'll go to Ed first. Maybe you can ask your question, Ed.
Yes, it was mentioned early in your lecture that the incidence or frequency of gender incongruence is estimated at being 0.6% to 3%. I seem to have seen some statistics that seem to render that at a much higher percentage. Could you comment on that, please? Or perhaps I missed something and misunderstood.
Yeah. I did mention that I saw something last week where this was one survey where they asked high school kids whether they identified as cisgender or something else. And 10% of them said they identified as something else. So I think it's really difficult to get a clear estimate of that because I think in our culture, kids are not sure. It may not take much to say, well, I'm not really cis. I'm, somewhere non-binary or whatever. So I wouldn't take those numbers too seriously. But I was just speaking with someone who identifies as queer, and this person said it's about 1%. But that's a very rough estimate. So your point is well taken.
I'm going to read this private question, Tony. It says, in public discourse, it is easy to find examples where conservatives are accused of pseudoscience and science denial. I think some of these accusations are quite valid. Do you think it's fair to say that at least some of the things said by left-wing voices regarding transgenderism also stray towards pseudoscience or science denial?
I would agree. I just think we have to be careful what to make of that, so we can't get into a tit for tat type of situation, which is why I spend many hours looking into this. You can always find a website or a YouTube video that supports your belief. And you can always find people who are misusing science to do that as well. And which is why, as Christians, I think it's incumbent on us to be really careful what we say, what sort of data we look at, and hold everything very tentatively.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. How about Robert? You have your hand up.
Yes, thanks. A very interesting presentation, disturbing in a number of ways. What I'm wondering is when, one quotes these surveys about percentages in various things and so on, but my sense from what you said is they're primarily with what we would call first world nations or Western, like Europe, North America, Australia. What is known about this in Asian countries and African countries, South American? Is anything known? If it is it basically the same? Or, for example,
that's a good question. I don't know. Part of it is if you're in a developing nation, the news is never going to get out about people who may be gender dysphoric or trans, so we won't know. These sorts of stories on news sites or whatever, they do catch my eye. So I do see examples of them in various places. But then someone needs to do the studies to identify the proportions. And there are so few studies already, even in our Western nations. And so it's a very good question. But gender dysphoria has always existed. So it's not like it didn't exist before. It's always been around. It's just, it seems to be much more prevalent now, and that's kind of a question. But
that's why I'm going to answer. Sure, yeah, that's why there's a big concern, though, right? Is that it's skyrocketing amongst teenage girls for some as yet to be determined reason,
right?
But it's not clear that's happening in many nations, or maybe it is, but.
Right.
I think that there seems to be a tendency to generalize the first world North American Europe experience to the whole planet. And it's not obvious to me that is indeed the case.
That's true, but we just don't have the data to say one way or another. But if people are saying, well, it's social media that's doing it, well, if people don't have access to social media, does that mean fewer cases of gender dysphoria? Right? That's a possibility, but it's another question that I don't have a good answer to. Sorry.
There's a public question in the chat. What is the suicide rate of those who have transitioned?
That's a very good question. Yes. Again, there aren't many studies on that. The suicide rate is still quite high, not as high as people who before transitioning. And I asked Greg Eilers about that, and he said, yes. He said part of it is people, if they don't pass well, their rejection by society. People who have transitioned don't have good jobs and things like that. So their social situation might not be a whole lot better, which again shows why we as the church should be much more encouraging and supportive of people who do that. So in short, the suicide rate is still high, but Greg Eilers would argue that it's for different reasons.
There's a private message. Could the predominance of female dysphoria be related to girls' perceived failure to attain the idealized female body image portrayed in ads, TVs, and movies? Could it be related to that?
It could be, but that's simply speculation. I don't know.
Ed rose his hand again.
Gender dysphoria. you mentioned a few moments ago that there have always been cases of gender dysphoria, but the graph that you showed that since 2010, 2011, there's been a rapid increase in the cases being reported.
Yes.
Seems to me to indicate that this is accelerating, and it's should be of concern to all of us. And I'm questioning, what is it? It's accelerating it. You talked about the TikTok tick and the role of social media. All these expectations of society seems to be having an influence even greater than in the past. And another question I have is there something in our environment? We're using all these cosmetics and shampoos and whatnot. Some of them may contain estrogen, or other molecules and chemicals that can affect the functioning of our hormones. I'm just trying to understand what it is, both in the expectations of society around us, as well as in the environment that may be causing this.
No, I agree. And in both cases, it's like it could be, you mentioned things in our environment, like bisphenol A can cause sexual aberrations in sexual development. I saw a paper just a few weeks ago that even Tylenol is an endocrine disruptor. So could someone have taken too much Tylenol at a critical time when she was pregnant, let's say, and it affected the fetus? We don't know. And so these are some urgent questions that we want to get answers to. But this is recent stuff. A lot of the papers I'm quoting, and the paper I wrote will be posted on the ASA websites in a month or so, where it goes into a lot more detail. We just have so many questions and so many could be situations, and no hard facts.
Okay, I'm going to go to another question, and then after I will go to Greg. So first, the question is it correct to say that gender is a spectrum? And at what moment is gender assigned or recognized? How do we help Christians and their families who are living with this and who may be fearful of being rejected by their friends?
Yeah. I wish I had a good answer to that. The challenge is disentangling gender from a person's behaviors as male or female, because the way a person acts as a male or female, that would be a spectrum. You can have people, kind of anywhere that way. That's not the same as gender. And there are some people who have gender dysphoria that are clearly binary. They may be in a male body, but they clearly perceive themselves as female, and that's binary. But then there's some other people that they say, I'm not really sure what I am, but I don't feel male or whatever. So it's hard to define what gender is. There aren't objective criteria. I did find a paper a year ago or so. They did a study of a review of many studies of gender dysphoria and say, what criteria do the counselors use to assess whether the person has gender dysphoria? And they found out that things were all over the map, and there really weren't good, rigid criteria, reproducible criteria for determining whether the person was gender dysphoric. And so it's really messy, and we really need to start standardizing things because the data is just so fragmentary.
So how can we help Christian families?
Pardon me?
Christian families, how can we help them? That was the second part of the question.
Oh, how can Christian families help them? Love the child the way they are, and help them through it, and keep the lines of communication open, because kids who are gender dysphoric, they know that they're different, and they hide it, and they may be internally stressed without revealing that to others, and so just keeping the lines of communication open. Easier said than done, but that's what I think needs to happen.
Okay, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Absolutely. And hi, how are you? That was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that with animals, you can only observe behavior. You don't really know what's going on. But are there any attempts to make animal models to study this?
Not that I've seen.
Okay.
Not that I've seen. So, some people may question the distinction between your how your brain is masculine or female and what your gender is. Some people say, no, there is no distinction. It's the same thing. But clearly, people who have gender dysphoria are a counter argument to that. But how can you measure someone's gender identity, or how can you measure a mouse's gender identity, or even some other animal? I wouldn't know where to start with that.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing you mentioned a couple times is that there's the approach now is to affirm individuals. I think back to probably 30 years ago, that would not have been the approach. It would. Right. So is everything geared towards affirmation now, or is there still some, well, let's work through this and with counseling?
Unfortunately, it seems not to be the case. There was somebody in Toronto, I think his first name is Ken Zucker, and he did take that approach, and he was accused of doing conversion therapy and basically lost his job over it. And so I think it's the American Psychological Association who said, this is the approach you shall take, you shall affirm. And so the counseling is called gender affirmation counseling. Now, hopefully, the counselor will be able to be probing enough to assess whether that really is the case.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to read another question from here, and then we'll go to Bob after that. So there's another anonymous question. Perhaps the numbers are skyrocketing because it is becoming more acceptable to come out than it used to be.
Yes, I think that is part of it, but then that doesn't answer the question why there's so many more females than males who are coming out. And also, you figure if the social cost is greater for a male to female transition, why don't they transition later on when they're adults? Because, they haven't worked through the dysphoria, but that isn't the case. It's just adolescent females. So whatever explanation needs to account for that difference between males and females.
Bob?
Thank you very much. And thank you, Tony, for a great talk. And I want to work in a quick hello to the McLaughlins there. With my background in geology, I'm quite comfortable with what we often hear, a statement in the ASA is that the Bible is not a science textbook, and we have to give it that respect. It's something much more important. And that often comes from our understanding of Genesis and our understanding of earth science. Can we say the same thing about biology?
Oh, definitely. If we're talking about evolution versus creation in 6 days.
Well, to be a little more specific then, and I don't know the answer. What about the question of human sexuality?
Right. People will have different views on this. And I think it's dangerous to take a clobber passage, as they call it, like, in Genesis 1, God created the male and female. That's it. End of story. But this is where the book, The Theology of the Body, which is a series of lectures that Pope John Paul II gave a long time ago. And then this person, Chris West, I think, was. So in the whole book, he's describing how the whole theme of Scripture is a theme of complementarity and relationships. And so just a few isolated Bible verses, no, that's not going to do it, because you can easily misuse that. And he's arguing there's a theme. Now, obviously, somebody like Austin Harkey would disagree with that. And that's why there are different Christian positions on that.
Thank you.
But yeah, your point is well taken.
Thanks very much.
I have one more question in the chat, and I have one question of my own. Okay, then I'll do the chat. We'll do Robert. So the chat was, has there been any sort of hormone therapy that will help the person feel okay in their sex instead of using hormone therapy to transition, but to stay?
That would be a magic bullet, I think. No. I mean, in Greg Eiler's case, he's taking estrogen and that resolves his dysphoria, but that's one person, and I haven't heard of any other examples of that. I think just understanding what estrogen or testosterone could do in the brain in terms of wiring the brain or changing the wiring and all that sorts of stuff. We don't know how the brain works in terms of some of these more complex processes like gender identity. And so I think we're so far away from designing some kind of drug that will fix that. So no, I don't think so.
Okay, so I think, Robert, do you still have your hand up?
Yeah, sorry, my internet disconnected there for a sec, or at least the Zoom part did. Sorry. So I guess I wonder what, in speaking to Christian families and how to help them, one likes to invoke the Bible, but I think honestly, the Bible has very little to say about this specific issue one way or the other. Would you agree with that?
I would agree. So I would say, are there Christian principles that you can use, or scriptural principles that you can use? Because obviously the Bible doesn't talk about trans stuff. If I can quickly grab a book off my shelf. This is a plug for Greg Eiler's. He's written a book. It's called Ministering to Transgender Christians. And so it's really helpful in explaining the situations and just being in touch, or giving advice on how you deal with that. So
in getting to that, I think I would agree. It's applying Christian principles, but the problem comes in that it's not clear which ones to apply. So, like, to give an example of what someone said earlier, I think that you agreed that some few decades ago, the affirmation would not have been used.
Yeah.
Now, all of a sudden, it is being used, but it's not the least bit obvious that this necessarily will improve things. Or is it? But I like one might argue that the problem with the old way is people really felt this way, you were suppressing them. But one could argue the problem with this other way is that maybe you are steering people in directions that will make them more miserable in by some other means, right?
Yes.
And so one senses the political climate is such that you better not dare question affirmation in the way maybe 30 years ago, you better not dare question whatever you would call non-affirmation.
Right.
Is that a fair statement?
I think it is a fair statement. Yeah. We just have to be careful how we approach it. Can we as Christians have a distinctively different approach that first shows love? I mean, it's really developing relationships with people regardless of where they are. And but it's just we know so little.
So I agree. But speaking on one side, I'll be honest, sometimes it feels like we're being asked to affirm smoking for some people, right? That we used to think like 50 years ago, people smoked and there was a little bit of evidence coming out. Certainly 70 years ago, nobody thought about it. Nowadays, nobody would affirm someone that wanted to smoke. So one wonders, is this something similar?
Right. So I think there's no, I think I know what you're saying, but I think we have to be careful in terms of affirming someone and developing a relationship with them. I think we as Christians should want to develop relationships with people with whom we disagree.
Yeah.
And because there's no way we can reach out to them if we're constantly battling them. And And so maybe it's in the context of a strong relationship saying, I disagree with what you're doing, but I will love you anyway and do what I can to support you. And that way, if the person changes their mind, the door is open to change. And right now they may feel trapped and not want to change because that's like admitting I'm wrong and that sort of thing. So again, it's all about the relationships. But no, I see what you're saying.
Okay, I'm going to have, there's another anonymous question, and then maybe Luke, and then after that, Ed. So the anonymous question is, in the Western world, we agree that human races are equal. So we quite rightly do not tolerate any public conversation that calls into question the equality of races. It seems to be a growing assumption that questioning transgenderism should be off limits in a similar way. But it isn't clear to me that this belongs in a similar category as race. I feel like I am being asked to accept a conclusion about transgenderism without being allowed to seek the truth on my own. Am I off base? I wonder if you can offer any guidance.
Yeah. Well, the antithesis is real. We live in a world that by and large does not hold to Christian principles. And so the challenge is, how do we as Christians live in a world whose worldview is often very different from us? This is nothing new for the church, and we just need to make our way as best as we can. And a big part of that is just loving people, developing relationships with people, and maybe sometimes sticking our neck out and being vulnerable. But again, how do we do that? Do we represent Christ very well when we're doing that? And so, yeah, it's that could be the case. And I admit I was nervous before giving this speech and this talk, and I'm nervous about the feedback I'm going to get from it. But I feel I have no choice but to use what I've learned to hopefully help the church and other Christians.
So it's almost 9 o'clock. So it's going to be Luke and then Ed, and then I have one last question, and then we're going to end it. There'll be the social time after that, which you guys can hang around if you want, or just go. It'll end after these next 3 questions, and you can hang around for a bit if you want. So go ahead, Luke.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation, Tony. I resonate very strongly with what you say about we should be able to love and develop relationship with people with gender dysphoria or transgender people and all this. And yet, depending on your Christian approach, you may be in this category where you disagree with them or say, or would feel the need to say, I don't affirm this. My sense, though, is that a lot of transgender people would probably say, if you don't affirm me, then you are not loving me, or something like that. And I find myself in a hard place because I want to love them and I want to have a relationship with them, but it almost feels like a prerequisite to doing that is to give up the integrity side of things or whatever. Mm-hmm. Do you have any experience or guidance or any helpful mental models that help one to navigate loving and having the relationship, but not affirming or something like that?
I wish I could say I can do that myself, but I don't do a very good job of that either. My youngest child has come out as gender fluid, and this is what has really stimulated me to do all this. And I admit my relationship with them is not what it should be. So whatever advice I give, it's advice to myself as well. The other example I can think of is Rosaria Butterfield. Now she's a lesbian, or she was a lesbian, and atheist, and she started going to church, and the pastor of this church just welcomed her and invited her for dinner and things like that, and just showed the love of Christ and didn't bring up the debate. So is there a possibility where you could actually just develop a relationship and stay away from the arguments for the time being until there's a relationship of trust that you can do that. But I agree, it's a hard line to navigate.
All right, Ed.
Thank you.
Thank you for speaking to us today. I did have a question for most of your presentation on talking about gender dysphoria. It has been revolving more around the issue of male-female binary. You know, are you male or are you female, or do you want to transition from one to the other? But today, the situation is really much more complex than that, because there are people who are identifying themselves as gays, as lesbians, as bisexual, as queer or questioning, as two-spirit. You know, there's such a vocabulary now that, you know, it's much more than whether one is male or female or feels that one is male or female. It seems that the whole issue has exploded out of the water.
Yeah, but that's also a different situation, because then we live in a culture where we can create our own identity and we can do whatever we want to invent ourselves. And so people with genuine gender dysphoria, they're not in that situation. They just feel an intense distress within themselves, and they don't like being that way. So to celebrate that I can be whatever I want, if I want to be two-spirit or whatever, that's a different worldview. And it's funny when you mentioned two-spirit. I think I watched a short video of Piers Morgan and he was arguing against the same sort of thing, but fully supporting someone who is trans in that same audience. So I think there's two different things there. Can you create your own identity and be whoever you are? That's one thing. The other thing is, if you're gender dysphoric and you have what may be a disability that needs to be resolved in some way, that's a very different thing. But it's true that sort of attitude exists, but that doesn't mean we have to go down that way.
Agreed.
Okay, for our last question, can you comment on the problems of being both a Christian and a scientist and exploring this particular area? What difficulties what kind of problems?
I haven't had any problems. So Dordt is a Christian university in the Reformed tradition, and the administration is fully aware of what I'm doing and what I'm saying, and they fully support me. Sorry, I think I lost my train of thought. Can you repeat the question, or was I answering it?
Yeah, it was. But I guess it was even more broad, like just the scientific. Science community. How does it welcome you as a Christian and doing science in this area and your particular perspective, maybe? Yeah.
Well, I'm not so much doing science as a Christian. This is more reviewing the topic. I'm not doing research in this area, but I think there are plenty of people who are non-Christians that might have a similar perspective to me, and Piers Morgan may be one of those. But I don't know. As a Christian, I haven't really had that sort of a conflict with my faith and my science. I teach a course that deals with religion and science, and we talk about the different models of Ian Barber and things like that. But I haven't experienced the conflict. It's more like there can be an apparent conflict. What if the science says, well, this is the way it should be, and the Bible clearly says this is the way it should be, and then we're in a conflict situation? As for me, I'm not at that place yet where I still have questions on both sides, and maybe it'll get to that point where it's more tough for me. But in general, I haven't experienced problems being a Christian in science, even when I used to be doing research.
All right, so it's 9:05. So I would like to thank Tony for this wonderful presentation. So our time is over, and so everyone you can feel free to leave. Tony and I will hang around a bit in case anybody wants to talk, or if we can talk to each other as well. If this was in person, we would be having coffee and tea right now and walking around the hallways.